Hello, this is lecture one of the course Introduction to Sociology, Sociology 1301, and it is an introduction to sociology, to the core concepts, basic ideas of the field. We will be referring to quite often throughout the course. A lot of what we cover here are definitions, and you should try to become familiar with these definitions. You don't have to memorize them word for word. If you look them up in our textbook, they're going to be different than what I've presented. I think these are better definitions than you will find in the textbook, but if you want to look at both of them and think about them, you can triangulate, so to speak, and come up with your own understanding of what the term means. Sociology is considered one of the social sciences. The social sciences include economics, political science, anthropology. Sometimes geography is included. Some aspects of geography definitely are. Also, other demography is sometimes considered a subfield of sociology and sometimes its own field. Demography is the study of populations, growth, the distribution of age distribution, uh, fertility, that sort of thing. So we're not really going to cover much demography. We'll touch on it a little bit, and when we get to near environmental sociology, which is at the end of the course. So sociology is often defined as the science of human social behavior. That people argue about that definition, whether or not sociology should be considered a science, or typically there are many of the methods of science are used to study human social behavior. I kind of go with the German approach. In German, there's no specific word that differentiates what we're sociology. Well, these sorts of studies that we're calling sociology, what C. Wright Mills, who I'll introduce in a bit, preferred to call social studies, from the hard sciences, so-called physics, chemistry, astronomy, those sorts of things. In German, the term Wissenschaft simply means systematic study, and that is applied to these hard sciences, physical sciences, biology, and so forth, as well as history, philology, sociology, political science. So I prefer that term myself. But if you want to consider it a science, that's fine. Many sociologists do and approach it that way. There's a debate about whether it's even necessary that sociology be a science. It depends upon one's theoretical orientation. What is the purpose of understanding human social behavior? So I'm getting ahead of the game here, but we will return to that debate in just a moment. So I'm going to share my screen and go through a presentation. Just give me 1 second. Okay. Introduction to Sociology. I believe the lecture is titled Core Concepts of Sociology, something along those lines. You need not worry about that. What is sociology? That's a good place to start. The word itself comes from the Latin word socius, meaning companion, and Greek word ology, usually the study of biology, study of life, bio. Uh, Anthropology, anthropo refers to humans for the most part. Ology, so the study of humans, uh, usually their culture and their physical being. Uh, the textbook, our free textbook, calls it the systematic study of society and social interaction. It's not a bad one. Another definition from George Ritzer, an eminent theorist of globalization and the consumer society is a little more complex, long-winded, systematic study of the ways in which people are affected by and affect the social structures and social processes that are associated with the groups, organizations, cultures, societies, and world in which they exist. Again, some emphasize the scientific approach. Many sociologists, maybe not many, enough, believe that the purpose of studying these things and understanding how institutions work, how people interact, and the impact of that interaction on self-image, self-esteem is important because this knowledge can be used to facilitate positive social change, making the world a better place. And to the extent that it's scientific, in the sense of a science where you have laws that allow you to predict what's going to happen, that's not quite so important. Now, you probably know in physics or chemistry, there are laws which allow you to, given a set of initial conditions, predict exactly what the outcome will be, usually using a mathematical equation. You don't have that in sociology. You may be able to predict likelihoods of certain types of behavior. So statistics is very important in scientific approaches to the study of human social behavior. We'll have a brief digression, excursion through the world of statistics. So brace yourself for that. It won't be too bad. You may have to take some formal statistics classes down the road. So it won't hurt to latch onto a few concepts early. Some more things. Harvey Mulisch, Columbia University. This is pretty straightforward. Sociology is what comes from human beings interacting. That covers a lot of ground. There's really almost anything you can think of that involves human beings interacting can be considered sociology. It's a very, you can write about just about anything and make it sociological if it's about people, particularly groups of people. Zygmunt Bauman, another sociologist, passed away a few years ago. He was a survivor of the Nazi camps, the Holocaust. Sociology, it's an analysis of the manifold webs of human interdependency. Manifold, you don't know, many webs, different types. The web, meaning we're connected to many other people. Interdependency, we're dependent upon others. We can't survive on our own. On our feet, we wear shoes that are made by somebody else. Clothing, the food, it's all, someone else is all producing this for the most part, unless you're living off the grid and growing your own vegetables and build a house with your own hands. You're with made your own tools for that matter. You're dependent upon others to a greater or lesser extent. You notice I haven't defined society yet. We will get to that. But one problem that used to occupy early sociologists, not so much anymore, because most sociologists have found an answer to this that satisfies them, and we'll cover several. Why is there such a thing as society? Why aren't people just on their own, individuals like cats or something? What holds society together? That was called the problem of order. Why is it not just random chaos? We'll talk about that. There are a few concepts which I'll use and I won't necessarily define. I may not remember to define. I just assume everyone knows that. That assumption is not valid. So I'm going to introduce a few basic ideas that you will encounter in other classes, in other fields, in the media, many places. The notion of a continuum, that means it's a continuous sequence of things and things kind of blend into one another. There's not a perceptual difference, for instance, between this shade of green and that one. It's just becoming a little yellower. Obviously, you can tell the difference between this purple and this. This is the spectrum of visible light, by the way. If you take physical science or have taken it, you know what this is. It is a continuum. It's a continuous range of values. Okay. Um, in statistics, you have two kinds of variables, continuous and categorical. Continuous are numeric. They be things that are not either or types of things, which are the categorical variables like gender. Let's say, for the sake of argument, two genders, male or female, one or the other. That's not a continuous function like this, or like weight, or like body temperature, or the number of animals in a population. That's a countable number. The type of animal, the species, that would be a category. Categorical. These are continuous, so continuum. Things blend into one another. A distribution is just a way of graphically displaying or treating mathematically the range of values of something, whatever it happens to be. This is an example. Household income is estimated in 2010 for the United States. So what this is a histogram in this case, but it shows the distribution. Distribution is just the range. Variance is the amount of difference there is from high to low. How, if everyone here made the same amount, every household made 50,000 a year in income, there would be zero variance. It's all the same, but as you can see, there is variance. In each of these slices, the histogram is a way of showing the population distribution and variation graphically that divides these continuous values into ranges, into groups. So households, in this case, 2010. If you zoom in on this in the PDF, you'll see that says under 5,000. So each of these bars is $5,000. So this second bar is household income 5 to 10,000 per year. 4% of households in the United States were estimated to be making $5,000 and $10,000 a year. That's not much. Okay. So you start to see a higher percentage for some of these other slices. What is this highest here? 6.2%. I believe that is 15 to 19,999. Again, this was 2010, so $20,000 works out for one person working full-time, $10 an hour. Minimum wage, these are folks that don't make a lot of money, don't have a lot of extra income. And it peaks around there and it starts to slope down. So when you're getting to households 50, or let's see, 125 to 130,000, we're down to about 1%. And it keeps going down until you get to the very high income. And it starts going up again. This is from 2010. This difference is even more extreme now. Currently, and this may be a couple of years old, and it is rounding up. If you take the 0.1%, and I'm going to talk about wealth now, not income. Wealth is what you've accumulated. Property, stocks and bonds, houses, cars, all that stuff is wealth. Savings. It's not your income. It's what you have accumulated or inherited from income and investments, or inherited from your family. So you can also look at this kind of thing differently in terms of you divide the population into larger groups and say what percentage of all the income does that group have? Or what percentage of all the wealth does it have? Right now, the top 0.1% of wealthy people, in other words, looking at the total wealth of the United States, and then you rank the households by wealth, the top 0.1%, so let's say that would be breaking the total distribution into 1,000 little slices, and the very last slice is the top 0.1%. They hold 33, about over 30% of the total wealth of the United States. 0.1% of the population. I guess our population is about 300 million now. So that's about 3,000 households. I think my math is right. 30,000 households. Yeah, I believe. I'm sorry, I'm not doing math well in my head. Doesn't matter. We'll get to all this later. It's just an example of the distribution. Uh, for these categorical things, distributions don't have this many slices usually. Think of a coin toss. It's heads or tails. That has what's called the binomial distribution. We'll talk about some of those. It's either one or another. Bi means two, nomial, name, nom. Okay, hierarchy, ranking of things. Often it is a pyramidal shape. You're ranking things on the basis of some value of something. This is Maslow's hierarchy of human needs in psychology. It's ranked on the value to human development, or stages of human development. You have to meet these first, and then these, and so forth. Physiological needs, food, sleep, taking care of your body, safety needs, still pretty much taking care of your body, housing, shelter from the elements, love and belonging needs, being part of a group, finding a partner, having a family. Esteem needs, that comes from organizations and larger groups you may be associated with. You're getting recognition for your efforts, your achievements, and so forth. And eventually, you may become a self-actualized human being. You've achieved your goals. You feel good about yourself. So, stratification is similar to hierarchy, and often the social stratification system is a hierarchy. I'll show you that in a moment. The term comes from geology, from Latin, I believe. Strata just means layers. So it's a layering of groups on the basis, again, of the value of something or other. The term, it comes from geology. If you've ever visited a part of the country or world that has actual topography, hills, valleys, and that sort of thing, and you driving down the highway, you'll see where the road is cut into rock, and you may notice layers like this. Those are strata. They're laid one on top of another, the oldest at the bottom, the youngest at the top, usually. There are exceptions. Geological events can overturn these things. Anyway, it's a layering. So social stratification deals with the economic class system, socioeconomic class, and so you can see the analogy there, the layers of the people with less wealth and income, the people with middle class, upper class, social stratification, class structure. Here's an example of class stratification, pyramidal. This would be during the Middle Ages of Europe, the feudal system. You had a king on top, peasants who worked the land on the bottom. Most people were peasants. Generally, if you weren't a peasant and you weren't one of the elite, you were a soldier of some sort. Could have been knights. Typically, this really only fit France, this model, but variants of it were found throughout Europe. Everyone is dependent upon the peasants growing the food that they must eat. The peasants are allowed to grow food and have cottages on land controlled by these folks who've been given this land by these nobles who have the right to use it, granted by the king. So you have a top down flow of power as well as prosperity and stability. The Aztecs also in Mexico had a class system, a little more complicated. They had formal slaves in addition to the peasants. Slaves typically in the ancient world were people who were captured in a war, in a battle, and put to work, fed and sheltered, and given just enough to keep them alive. Sometimes they could be freed. Um, anyway, so Aztecs had slaves in addition to the peasants, commoners who maybe are artisans, make shoes and pots and things. Then you have a category of government officials, people who can write and keep records and so forth, the higher level of the military hierarchy, and then you have the ruler who often, both in this system and that system, they rule by some sort of connection to the divine, to a God, the divine right of kings. In this case, we believe that God ordains certain individuals to have power over everyone else. Here's another pyramid, more recognizable class system. This is from, it fits the UK, England, Great Britain better. We'll see one for the United States later. The elite, upper class, middle class, lower middle, working class, and then the poor, the homeless and unemployed. Sometimes those are called, there's a layer of those in the U.S. we call the underclass. People on the streets, homeless. Uh, the worse off among us. Okay, some other concepts I'm going to mention and I will explain concern space and time. I'll often refer to the West or the Western world, and that's Europe, the United States, plus parts of the world typically that were formerly colonies of Europe, Australia, New Zealand. They're not always included as the West, but their culture, their language, of course, is much the same as we see in Europe, the United States, Canada. The East generally means Asia and the Middle East. Okay, CE for a date, the year 1000 CE. You may have heard of BC before. And AD. Most scholars now use CE and BCE. CE is the common era. It's basically the same as AD. It begins at the same time. Years are the same. The first used 1615 by Kepler, who was an astronomer. BCE, before the Common Era, that's the same thing as BC, which meant before Christ. AD meant Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord, after Christ was born. Someone realized not everyone in the world, not even most people in the world, were Christians. So why have a time scale that refers only to one religion, so they replace it with a secular time scale? Common Era and before Common. Capitalism I mentioned a lot, and we don't talk much about it until later in the course, so I'm giving you a definition now. This is very wordy. It's dense. Here's the main aspects, these first two, really. It's the economic system under which we live, and it's the dominant system in the world at the present time. There are a few others. You may think of China and Vietnam as communist system, but in the past 20 years, their economy has changed to such an extent that they're basically capitalists now. There are still enterprises that are owned by the state, but they are a minority, owned and operated by the government, controlled by the government. So capitalism is based on market competition. Companies compete uh, with each other in order to sell products, often fairly equivalent products. They compete on the basis of price, but more often it's brand. That is, you want a certain brand to identify with that. So sometimes you'll pay more to have that brand association. The means of production, which means the factories, the distribution centers, the mines, the large agricultural production, meat packing plants. They're owned privately, not by the government. And why are people buying these things and competing on the market ultimately? Is it because they want to satisfy our needs and help us out, do us a favor? No, they're doing it for a profit, to make money. Okay. Another aspect of it is capital, which is another term for the means of production in addition to banks and land and so forth. Capital is privately owned. Labor is privately held, privately controlled. We can decide to work at a particular place that's offered us a job or decline, in theory. In theory, capitalist theory, they say we are free to choose who we work for. Well, there's a problem with that. Sometimes, quite often, people have to take whatever job they can. If you need money to buy food and pay your rent, how, how free are you in the job market? There's a limited amount of choice there, but not always. But anyway, there are markets for both capital and labor. What are the capital markets? Stocks and bonds. Those are investments in ownership or investments in loans to people who are operating businesses and bonds. And there's a labor market, obviously. So you can read some of these other things. There are just a lot of ways to try to define capitalism. It is going to recur in almost every lecture we have. I'm going to make reference to capitalism because that is what we deal with in the United States, in Europe, in most of the world now. Okay, ideology. Some view ideology as just the general beliefs of a particular group, a country. You may have heard the term the American ideology, or these, in the old days, the communist ideology, or and so forth. But it is a collection of beliefs, but it kind of structures your view of how the world works and your place in it. Ideologies are something we learn from cultural institutions, from our parents, cultural institutions like the educational system, religion, and so forth, that we come to accept certain things about how the world works. Ideologies are systems of beliefs that make what happens seems like it's natural. That that's just the way the world is. And people in different cultures have different views of the way the world is. But you typically, if you are in the grip of an ideology, as we all are, we cannot escape it, according to many people, particularly a very prominent analyst, social theorist, Slavoj Žižek. You can watch his take on ideology here. It's a brief clip from a film about films, science fiction film called They Live. Take a look at it if you like. Um, his accent is heavy, and he's going to go a little deeper than I ever will in this class. Please take a look. Hegemony has different meanings. For us, it's going to mean domination that is derived by really control of social and cultural institutions. People agree to be dominated, to be ruled by an elite, because they've accepted an ideology that has been transmitted through these institutions, and that ideology, that system, is called hegemonic. It is the one that is the most important, one with power. Sometimes you'll hear that applied to countries in terms of like the military hegemon, right? Until recently, maybe still, I would say the United States is the global hegemon, hegemonic militarily. There are challenges to that. The term and its use comes from a writing called The Prison Notebooks by an Italian Marxist revolutionary, Antonio Gramsci. Very influential book. He was in prison most of his life for his political activity. Anyway, so if the system is hegemonic, the ruling elite is dominating the masses who have agreed implicitly to be dominated because they view that that is the natural order of things. The sociological imagination, that is listed, I believe, in our course objective syllabus. It is, I'm not even completely sure it is mentioned in the textbook, the free textbook. It probably is, but I have trouble often finding things in that index. It's a terrible index. Um, Let me look up Mr. Mills, C. Wright Mills, the uh, person who gave us the concept of the sociological imagination, which is a very, very important concept. Do we find Mills in the index? No, we do not. We do not. Let's see if sociological imagination. Sociological imagination is in the book in chapter 1 on page 6 and 22, which might even be chapter 22. So you'll read about it if you read the chapter. C. Wright Mills, Charles Wright Mills. He wrote a book that was titled The Sociological Imagination, published in 1959. It was very influential in the 1960s on the generation of sociologists that were beginning to study in the sociology in the late 1960s. One of my advisors said you tended to, just the mention of his name, and you would do some sort of, well, I was going to say genuflect before his name, cross oneself, as he's, the equivalent of a secular holy man in many ways for a lot of sociologists. He was from Texas. He started his college career at Texas A&M, didn't really fit in, transferred to the University of Texas at Austin, got a degree in philosophy. Went to graduate school at the University of Madison, or the University of Wisconsin at Madison, which had a very active and respected sociology program. Got a doctorate from them and a teaching post at Columbia University in New York City, one of the elite Ivy League schools. Well, Mills had a different approach to sociology than what was dominant at that time. Sociology was dominated by a theory that we will call structural functionalism later. We'll get to that. Talcott Parsons, the head of the Department of Social Relations at Harvard, was the king of structural functionalism. Let's say he'd written a very large book called The Social System, which was very complex and created many definitions and graphs and charts explaining each social system and how they fit together. Usually there were groups of four and then four within four and so on. I had to memorize all of this several times. You will not have to memorize any of that stuff. But Talcott Parsons, his background was biology, so he tended to systematize things. He made this huge system. And in this period, post-war America, 1945 into, like, let's say 67, it's considered, that's a period called the golden age of capitalism. The United States was the dominant power globally. They were in a Cold War with the Soviet Union, an alternative to capitalism. But nevertheless, the United States was the most powerful nation on earth. The American worker was making good money. It was a good time for people if you were white, and particularly if you were male, and if you were straight or you could stay in the closet. This is the 1950s of the movies American Graffiti. You may have seen some sitcoms set in that era. Widely believed to be okay. Everything was fine until the 1960s, and then one day we had hippies and anti-war protests, and suddenly feminists and environmental activists, and which is all true, that those movements did come out of the 60s and the anti-war movement, really. People learned to protest and demonstrate and organize in the movement to stop the war in Vietnam, which the United States eventually stopped, and more or less we left Vietnam. We did not, we were defeated in Vietnam by a much technologically weaker state using different tactics than had been used in previous wars. It was a very divisive period in our history. This period of time, political moment, historic moment, we are also divided, like we have not been since the late 1960s. So we made it 60 years, roughly 50 to 60 years, and we didn't have social media back then. If we had, it would have been much more of a chaotic than today, I believe. So anyway, so in Mill's book, he criticized the way sociologists did their business. He did not think that the kinds of things they were doing, surveys and statistical analysis, were yielding the kind of information that ordinary people could use. The information wasn't generally doing anybody but the small core of sociologists who were publishing their work and getting tenured. It was doing them some good, but not too many other people, like journalists, or it didn't provide tools with which you could understand the world. So he said you needed to change the focus of sociology. You needed to use what he called a sociological imagination to create things that people could relate to their daily lives. Okay, he's sociological. Okay, by the way, Mills was someone, he was type A. He would get in others' faces and tell them in the halls of Columbia University that they were on the wrong path. They were wasting their time. He rode a motorcycle to this elite school in New York, wore a leather jacket to class in a period when every professor wore a suit and tie. He wore pointy Texas boots on occasion. He doesn't have them on in that photo. Nevertheless, he died young. I guess that is what is that even its age? Well, anyway, I think he wasn't 50 years old. He was 46 when he died of a heart attack. He was preparing for a debate concerning the American invasion of Cuba, American-sponsored invasion of Cuba that had just failed. Sociological imagination is a way of viewing the social world. I tend to think, I focus on connecting what he called personal troubles of milieu, but elsewhere just called personal troubles, with public issues, social structure, the government policies, what's going on in the economy as a whole. Trying to see the connection between how your life is going, what's happening to you, and what's happening in a realm beyond your control for the most part. An example. You may have been in a situation, you may be now, when you're looking for a job and you can't find one, and people tell you, well, you're not looking hard enough, there are plenty of jobs. I've been in that situation, it's pretty common. It becomes a kind of blaming the victim, because there are times, and this is one of those times, when the economy is not doing well. Recessions, which is, we've gone beyond recession now, we're heading towards what's called a depression, which is as bad as it usually gets in a capitalist economy. Um, Recession is a downturn, depression is more of a collapse. In a recession, and particularly in a depression, jobs are scarce. Jobs have disappeared. It doesn't matter how hard you look. You may not find a job that is suited to you, or any kind of a job. And you may, if people are telling you you're not looking hard enough, you may internalize that. Blame yourself. It's just me. But no, it's not you. Someone else, some other institutions have perhaps done things, made decisions that have resulted in what you're going through, filtered through other actors. So, another example, you may have student loans. I have student loans. I'm 65 and I've almost paid off my student loans. There's backstory to that. I got a second master's degree after I was already working, thinking for Harris County, thinking it would allow me to advance and get away from the laboratory environment. Now, I hadn't mentioned my day job right now. It involves the statistical analysis and management of environmental data, specifically water quality data, what's in the bayous and lakes and the Gulf around us. I do this as part of a contract my organization has with the state. But prior to that, my occupational history was in laboratories, environmental laboratories, working from doing tests in drinking water labs to quality control and assurance in general environmental labs. Finally, I escaped the laboratory environment altogether, but I'm still in the environmental field. Hence, part of my focus on environmental sociology. My other big focus, the bigger focus, is sociological theory. So I may talk about that more than you're really interested in hearing, especially since there's no time clock, a bell to end the class. So I apologize in advance. I thought I could get out of the lab environment totally with a master's degree in public administration. I was working full time. I couldn't, and I found a totally online master's program, University of Texas at Arlington. This was in the early days of online education, and I couldn't afford it. I wasn't paid that well by the county at that point, so I borrowed money, and I borrowed more than I needed. Later, I got married. My wife lost her job. I had to go on my insurance. I got deferments because paying for health insurance is expensive. You can get deferrals and timeouts from your payments. Interest can build up still on the balance. That happened a couple of times. They seem more than happy to let you do that because they're earning interest no matter what. The government does make money on student loans, so don't let anyone tell you otherwise. So anyway, so I have those. But you typically, as an undergraduate, I had a few, but not much. It wasn't necessary. Grants and work study jobs and a little bit of support was enough because college was not as expensive. Why has it become so much more expensive? Well, we have more tech. The it used to be a blackboard and chalk and a chair. That's what you needed. There's more stuff now. There are more administrators to deal with more rules, and they've given themselves bigger salaries over time. Additionally, the amount of support that's provided by the state here meaning the government in general, there are several states in our case. We have the federal government, the state of Texas, the county, the city. These are all groups, organizations that are part of the state, broadly defined, as we'll define it much further down the road in the class. The aid that comes to colleges for their operations, the money, and that's available to students for grants and loans and things, has been declining over time. Why has it been declining? Tax cuts. The people, the Congress, the legislatures have lowered taxes systematically on the theory that by lowering taxes, they're going to stimulate the economy and then they'll actually get more revenue back at a lower rate. It never happens. They say it continually. Every time they're advocating a tax cut. Now, nobody likes to pay taxes, but the taxes are that's the price of civilization. That's what pays for the roads, what pays for uh, defense, such as it is. For now, it's paying for the police. There's a defund the police movement. It pays for social services, aid for people who are disabled, who need health care, just all manner of things. And a part of it used to go to funding education. It still does, just a smaller amount because taxes have been cut. So as the cost of college has gone up and the aid that's being given by the state to cover some of this has gone down, the share paid by students and their families has gone up. So they've increased the amount of money one can borrow, and you want almost, if you go to a state university, unless your family is fairly well off, you're going to have to borrow a significant amount of money. Uh, so you may end up in a situation, you graduate, you can't find a job, your student loans come due, and you are in trouble. I've been in that situation. I got in that situation before I'd finished a degree, and that is bad because once you're in default, you cannot get a college to send your transcript to another college. You can't finish college until you make some arrangements to or pay off those loans. I don't know if it's still quite so draconian. I think it is, but it's something they hold over you to get you to pay. There are other things they can do, but right now, there's more student loan debt than there is credit card debt in the United States. Some say it's the next financial bubble that's going to result in another financial crisis, but we will see. There are proposals to do something to ease the burden, but the proposals all have downsides. Uh, so you have to borrow more money, and you may be in a position where you're paying, you're making your payments, and they are so large you can't buy a house. You have trouble paying your other bills. You can't buy a new car. You have to go to get a high interest loan to get a used car. So your personal troubles are connected with politics, with people being elected because they advocate cutting taxes. So that's an example that you may relate to. Another aspect of using a sociological imagination is try to drop your preconceptions, even your moral code, your sense of what's right and wrong, and how things should be, and look at the social world as if you're an outsider. You're not part of it. You're an alien from another planet just observing Earth people in some particular area. So, also, just trying to understand the world from another person's point of view is part of the sociological. More definitions, because some of these I mentioned and haven't defined. Social structure. These are the patterns of behavior on social arrangements. They don't change very much. They do change over time, not very fast. These are just the types of things that persist over time. Some say they're similar to institutions, so I'll mention that some examples when we get to institutions as structures, but don't think of them as something that is fixed and permanent for all time. These structures, they do change. Social processes are happening kind of within the social structures. These are the details of how things go. Like everybody needs clothing, but a social process may be the fashion cycle and how wearing the most up-to-date clothing may affect your acceptance by a particular group of people, or wearing a specific kind of clothing may uh, um, signal your membership in a specific group, consuming specific things. I mean, people have been eating food forever, but they have not been eating the kinds of things we eat, for instance. There was nothing but free range chicken in the early days, but there may not have been There definitely weren't microwavable dinners for most of human history, but it's food. So that's just an example. Culture I've mentioned, I believe, maybe not. Culture is the toolkit that people in a given society, which I'll define to later, have to just to get by, to do what you have to do to survive in the world. And it varies by geographic area, the part of the world that the group you are a member of. I'm not yet breaking them up into nations or anything like that, but often that is how within one so-called political nation you may have several cultures that have different toolkits, different sets of ideas, values, beliefs. Material objects are part of culture. Some people eat horse meat. Some cultures, horse meat is an acceptable food. In other cultures, no, you can't. You can't conceive of doing that. Other sorts of things. In China, it said, uh, there was something called the era of wild flavor, where eating wild caught game, the most exotic you could find, and it still persists, was a mark of social esteem. It was a something people tried to do. This led to the wild markets with wild animals caught in the forest that were in cages stacked one on top of the other, and where coronavirus emerged first. The wild markets of Wuhan, China. It's not the first time a virus that caused an epidemic, bordering on a pandemic, emerged from a wild market. Another coronavirus, SARS-CoV-1, came from civets, which are like marmosets. They're often considered cats. There's a type of coffee that's considered the best in the world. It's somehow, and it sounds disgusting. I've never had it. They feed the civets coffee beans, and they're not completely digested. They pass through. They're altered slightly, and then the coffee beans are collected from the let's say the waste products of the civets digestion. Okay, but in the wild market, the civets were food. All manner of creatures are food. The North Chinese have said that the South Chinese will eat anything that flies except an airplane. So that's part of culture, material culture, clothing, obviously. Um, so, pardon me. I don't know if you saw that. Social behavior. What is that? You kind of have an idea, you know what that is, but here's a formal definition from Max Weber, a very important sociologist. We're going to return to him again and again. His definitions, his concepts they probably are more important than those of any other sociologist up to this point in time. Any behavior that takes account of another person's needs, inclinations, or desires. Social behavior. There's some behaviors we do almost instinctually, or they're totally self-oriented. For instance, you go for a walk in the country or a park, and there might be rain, so you have an umbrella. It starts to rain, you open your umbrella. That's not social behavior. However, let's say you're on a crowded street and it starts to rain. Now, opening that umbrella is going to involve looking around and taking account of others. If you don't do that and you just pop it open, you might hit someone in the eye, and then the type of social behavior you have is going to be different than if you had just been careful. Somebody will probably not be happy. So, takes another person's needs, inclinations, desires, or even physical presence into it. So, back to structural things, institutions. Institutions are really just bundles of rules, practices, how things are supposed to be. But we give them names like the family, religion, educational institutions. And they're really just bundles of rules and practices, how people go about things. So it's very similar to structure, a little bit different. So think of the family. There's been, take it back to social processes. There's been something like a family unit for most of human history, probably all. But how the members of the family relate, what's expected of them. For instance, in the 1950s and 1960s, when Talcott Parsons had figured out sociology and social behavior, it was common for the male, the husband, to go to work, the mother, the woman, to stay at home and raise the children. And for Talcott Parsons, this was the normal, the best way for families, this institution to operate. How did he know that? Well, because America was the most powerful nation in the world. It worked best here. People were prosperous. Of course, he's not looking at people of color. He's not taking how women feel about this into account. If you are LGBT, you're just off the radar altogether. It was not a paradise for any of those folks. However, but anyway, the family, what's been expected, has changed over time. The families now are far more than a man, a woman, or can be much different than a man, a woman, and their children. You have blended families from different marriages. You have all manner of permutations and combinations, but they're still a family. It's still that institution. Okay. The butterfly effect is another concept that kind of it highlights this interdependency that Zygmunt Bauman mentioned and how we're all connected. It comes from something called chaos theory, which is a mathematical theory, very technical, which is about finding order in what appears to be random. So meteorologists predicting the weather, they are kind of partaking of this point of view in a sense. But it's called the butterfly effect, from a saying that a butterfly flapping its wings in the Amazon basin can cause a tornado in Nebraska. It just ripples through, is magnified by other systems. Okay. An example of that was common when I started teaching, something called the Arab Spring, when many people rose up against the existing governments in Libya, in Tunisia, in Egypt, and overthrew them. These movements were primarily driven by young people, and social media was a somewhat important aspect of that, not as important as we were led to believe at the time. But there was a specific incident that galvanized this whole movement. Someone killed himself by setting himself on fire as a protest in Tunisia, I believe. I've forgotten his name. And he put it on Facebook or some other media platform, and it obviously went viral. And this was a very powerful statement of protest, to say the least. So it spread throughout the Middle East. Reification you should learn to use this term and baffle your friends and neighbors. It's treating an abstract concept like society or social structure as if it's a thing. It has some physical existence, or it's real. It's a concept, it's a belief, but you treat it as if it is a real thing out there, and it has effects. Sometimes, though, people use it for the process where a social relationship has been marketized, commodified. Like, instead of having an extended family that can help you with childcare, you have companies that are taking care of your children for profit. You find them in a marketplace for such services. That's another way some people use reification. Sociologists and philosophers use it in the first sense. I'm going to take a break now. We're 2/3 of the way through this lecture. I'm going to stop the share and pause the recording. You won't know the difference. Okay, I hope that wasn't too long a break for you. You didn't get too bored waiting for me. And let's go back to the screen share. Okay, big picture items that sociologists have studied. Social change, and use what you're seeing here, stages of social formation, as it were, different ways of conceptualizing the present moment, the near past, and near future. Uh, Looking backwards, sociology was born really to by people who were it was created, pardon me, by people who were attempting to explain two big events, explain and understand the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution. The French Revolution upset the political order. The King of France, who people had always had obeyed simply because he was the king and his father had been king and his father, and so on and so forth, ordained by divine right, was overthrown. A republic was created where some people became citizens who could vote. A lot of other things ensued as a result of the French Revolution. Uh, the ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity, which is similar to solidarity, were spread by Napoleon's armies throughout Europe. Perhaps more important in many, or just as important in changing the way people lived, was the Industrial Revolution. The French Revolution had established the possibility that people could rule themselves in some sort of democratic fashion. The Industrial Revolution changed their way of life altogether. We went from an era of feudalism of a sort in some places. The Industrial Revolution occurred differently in different parts of the world. It began in England, where most of the feudal, that is the stage of society that was common in the Middle Ages in Europe, most feudal structures had already fallen by the wayside. But it had been common for people to work at home. The entire family might be involved in weaving or spinning cotton to make textiles of some sort, making ribbons, what have you. And the Industrial Revolution ended that way of making a living by concentrating people in large factories. Ways were found to power machinery in a large building. Initially, this machinery was powered by water, later by coal and steam engines, coal-fired steam engines. England had a lot of coal. It had a lot of iron to build railways and other machines. So, additionally, the English had their agricultural production system was more efficient than in many parts of Europe. Fewer people were required to produce enough food for the population. Now, people had, been used to working at home, their own hours, their own time, taking holidays as they wished, and there were many church holidays that people took. They would drink, they would have games, feasts, festivals on these holidays. When the Industrial Revolution began and people were expected to report for work at a certain time of day in a factory and work 10, 12 hours, 6 days a week, it was a difficult transition. Um, People had to learn the notion of clock time. It's not something you're born with. Uh, in feudal society and simple agricultural society, time is a matter of where is the sun at that particular time. During the Planting season, the warm months of the year, you work sun up to sundown. During the winter, you might not work at all. So, we'll talk more about those things later. The second industrial revolution was another wave of change that spread through the Western world. This refers to the spread of railroads. Well, actually, it refers more to communication uh, virtually. Railroads are a form of communication in that you can take messages by train, you can travel, and so forth. Second industrial revolution involved electricity, the telegraph, and the internal combustion engine. Automobiles began to be produced. The horses were displaced until actually railways were steam engines and railroads were developed during the Industrial Revolution, the latter part of the first Industrial Revolution. A horse was the fastest way to get anywhere, or that had been that way for a couple of thousands of years, actually, since the domestication of the horse. Horses were draft animals used to pull plows, used to pull wagons for transport. The horses were literally put out to pasture or worse. So there have been several books written about our relationship with the horse and how it changed radically not so long ago. The End of the Horse is a book that you might find interesting if you such a thing sounds like it would. So, second industrial revolution, electricity, electric lights, the telephone, the automobile. Post-industrial society is referring, for the most part, to an era after the Second World War, when more and more people were working in offices than factories. People had service jobs of all types that proliferated. So Daniel Bell wrote a book called The Coming of Post-Industrial Society, which set the tone for that whole post-industrial discussion. Others later said, we are not in post-industrial society, we are in postmodern society. Postmodern society is a bit hard to explain briefly, but basically in the postmodern era, images and symbols are more important than things. Consumption becomes more important than production. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. The postmodern theorists, they came out of philosophy. There were postmodern sociologists who applied the ideas to sociology. Most theorists have moved on from that, but some of the ideas of the postmodernists were a radical skepticism towards big stories, meta narratives they were called, like that were created by Karl Marx to explain the march of history, looking at things from a global 20,000-foot view and trying to explain the march of any kind of change on the basis of a handful of concepts. Postmodernists were and are, to the extent they're still around, skeptical of notions of truth. What is truth? Who decides what is true and what isn't? Some of that is you can understand where that might come from by thinking about how do we know the history of the Middle Ages or of ancient Rome? How do we know that? We don't have films. We don't have audio recordings. We have a limited number of writings. And it was typically the elites, the most powerful people in society, that wrote down these stories and made these claims. The vast majority of the population of Rome, for instance, was unheard. Slaves, that one eventually were the bulk of Roman society. So truth becomes something that is created in order to obtain or hold power, created by elites for the postmodernists. very skeptical about science. They don't believe the truths of science are necessarily as solid as scientists would believe that they are. And finally, the idea of progress, they were extremely skeptical. It was an illusion, again, created by elites to show how well they'd been doing and maintain. So, other ways to characterize the present moment: the information society after the communications and information revolution, computers, the internet, etc. The consumer society, where people consume a lot of stuff, a lot more stuff, and a lot more rapidly in terms of turnover of fashions and styles than in any period before now. We still are a consumer-oriented society. And globalization, finally, the increasing interconnection of different countries and peoples, initially through trade, the exchange of goods, which led to the exchange of ideas, the exchange of cultural products and practices, and also the increased ease that people had moving around the world. Uh, the airports built in every country, airlines servicing every country, every capital city in the world, and in most cases for the developed societies, many of the smaller cities in the world in that country. So we may be seeing globalization come apart, so to speak, right now. Global supply chains took a big hit when so many people were locked down at home. We'll see how that all plays out. There's a debate as to whether it is going to mark the end of this era of globalization. There's talk of bringing back to the United States, or if you're European, to various European countries, certain kinds of economic activities, particularly the production of medicines and face masks and gloves that had been shifted for the most part to China. So China and India make actually India makes most of the generic drugs, but they're using chemicals, ingredients that they import from China. So most of our prescription medication is coming from overseas right now, at least the affordable stuff. So time will tell. Globalization was kind of and I believe it still is. It's sort of the idea that orients a lot of social theorists in their thinking, and that and the information society. Some are really all three of these are just different sides of the world we are living in now, different aspects of it to approach the whole through different ports of entry, so to speak. An idea that I don't want to say it came and went because the book is still being published and still being assigned to undergraduate sociology courses. Typically at larger universities, you may have to buy the textbook, but you're going to have to buy one or more additional books to read. There are two books which kind of dominate that list of books, which are supplements for introductory sociology classes. One of them is The McDonaldization of Society, which is just an explication of how the way that fast food restaurants are organized, how they set up their system for quickly producing food for someone in a very short period of time, have been applied to more and more aspects of our social life. So if you're interested in that, here's a talk by George Ritzker. He came to HCC in 2015 and gave a talk because we had adopted his textbook, and the publisher sent him down to have a Q&A and a little talk about McDonaldization and other things. He's more focused on consumption now and what he calls prosumption. An aspect of prosumption is the increasing spread of or proliferation of self-checkout lines. How we do the work that used to be done for us for free. There are many manifestations of that maybe one of the biggest one is all the data we provide to big tech companies like Google, Facebook, uh, Amazon, which they use for their own benefit or package and sell to others, particularly after they have analyzed patterns. It's the era of big data, powerful computers and lots of data online. Analyze patterns in people's choices, what they buy, what they consider buying and don't, the factors that go into making a choice. They create algorithms which can predict if a given person with a given set of traits is looking at a particular item online, what are they likely to do? What are they likely to buy? Are they going to buy something somewhat similar? If so, then in milliseconds, maybe nanoseconds, a little auction takes place behind the scenes as soon as you've loaded that web page between different providers of this good or service. You don't know what's happening. I don't remember the name of the organization that sells this service to. There are several now, I'm sure, that organize these mini auctions that take place almost instantaneously as we are browsing the internet. The people pay for our eyeballs, our attention. Tiny, tiny, tiny amounts on thousands of machines at once, but it can pay off. So, and we are providing the data for free that is used for creating the patterns that these systems rely on. But the McDonaldization of society really it's an application of Max Weber's theory of rationalization to the contemporary era. But if you worked at a McDonald's, these probably look familiar. Standardized step-by-step procedures to create efficiency. The manager of a store can calculate his expected profit and loss, and from data which is gathered almost automatically. Uh, from this information, knowing your month-to-month sales, you can predict what you have to order, and also control. The process is automated and standardized to the extent possible. Every McDonald's hamburger looks the same. So finally, talking about society, it's time to define it. Here's a couple definitions. The second one is probably better than the first. Ritzer is a little long-winded. George Ritzer began the McDonaldization theories. Group of people who share a common culture. Remember, culture is the toolkit, the things that you need, ideas, values, material things that you use to get by in the world. Share a common culture. They're in a particular geographic area, and they also believe they are part of a unified society. Society is, in many ways, it's this belief that people hold. Society is what people believe that it. Auguste Comte, the man who came up with the word sociology, sort of, he's the one given credit for applying the word to this particular field that became what we now call sociology. Another individual had used the word for it to mean something else. Comte's first choice was social physics, but he found out someone was using that already for something different. So he grabbed sociology thinking it was available. And we continue to give him credit. He was the first sociologist to try to apply some statistical methods to understand the social world. And his goal was to find laws of social behavior, which were analogous to laws of physics, for instance. And knowing these laws and the conditions in a particular area, a particular society or culture, you could predict the result of various sorts of interventions things that government could do. The goal was to try to change, his goal was to change society for the better. Um, he viewed society as more or less an object that was capable of understanding in the same way that rocks, planets, plants were understandable, could be understood using scientific methods. Charles Horton Cooley, someone that we will link with the symbolic interactionist school theory, thought society was just an abstraction in the mind. So I kind of am with Randall Collins in a way, and society, it's the chain of individual and group interactions. That's all it is. There is no thing as society beyond. There are people interacting, and there are patterns in their interactions. And the environment in which they are interacting can determine the patterns. If they are, for instance, employed in a particular workplace, that economic organizations are institutions. They are in the same organization. They're going to relate in certain ways. This, if they are members of the same religious institution, they will relate in ways that members of other religious faiths may not. Anthony Giddens, a very important sociologist, still alive, the only one of these three that is, had an idea called the double hermeneutic. Now, don't worry about that word, but basically, it is really, for me, it's the reason you can't have a science of sociology that is predictive, that is in the same sense that you can predict outcomes of a chemical reaction, for instance. Uh, when people know something about a particular pattern, they can change it. If they find out that having a lot of children makes it less likely that they will be prosperous, then they may start having fewer children. And as this spreads, as this knowledge of this effect spreads, suddenly it disappears. You can't find it in the data. It's gone. Why does this happen? Well, people have agency. They have the power to change their behavior. They have free will. They may be steered in certain directions and do things that are predictable, but ultimately they have free will. So is this thing called society real? Cooley said, no, it's really just in the mind. Some, like Comte and also Durkheim, the functionalists perhaps to a certain extent, they see it as kind of a thing that is in the world to be explained by people who are observing it at a distance. Again, others think it's not a thing, it's the combined effect of interaction between people. It's another reification. I mentioned that earlier, treating a concept as if it's real. However, it is real in the sense that interactions sum up to something and they have an impact that has real effects. We'll revisit that idea talking about the Thomas theorem, but shortly. Um, and also there are patterns. It's not just random action, random events occurring and causing random consequences. So sociologists tend to look at the world. Different sociologists will usually look at social world when they design their research from one of two levels of analysis. Micro level, which is concerned with individuals, small group dynamics, and so forth, and the macro scale, large scale, big picture stuff, history, the economy, changing economy over hundreds of years, the impact of social class on educational achievement, large political change over time. So, and you can combine the two. There's two examples here. I'm not going to belabor the point. Back to agency, I already mentioned that. Agency is your ability to make an independent choice to act differently than someone has predicted or expects you to act. that expectation could be based on previously observed structural patterns. Uh, Ritzer, in his text, he referred to people with agency as dangerous giants. They can disrupt social life. They can punch above their weight, so to speak, when they decide to. Okay, so again, I defined social structures earlier. Here's a little more information about them, but from a slightly different point of view. Finally, Anthony Giddens pointed out that social structures, these patterns, institutions in particular, with bundles of rules, really, it's mostly what they are, they have a double nature. They constrain you means they prevent you from just doing any old thing you want if you're going to be functioning within that structure. But they're enabling as well. They make it possible for you to do something. An example that he's used and others, language. If you are learning a foreign language, there are rules to conjugating verbs, to punctuation, pronunciation, all those little rules you have to learn, memorize, and follow if you're going to communicate effectively in that language. So you're constrained, you follow a path. But once you learn it, that expands your world. You can communicate with someone in another land. Having a second language is a economic asset in the job market generally. So it enables perhaps greater degree of prosperity. It enables travel, broadening your experience. Finally, talk about social constructivism. This in sociology, it's the idea that a lot of aspects of our social life are constructed by humans. They're not something which, and many people would think this is the way the world is, that would come from ideology, for instance, learning a set of ideas that you've accepted that make what you see around you, how it happens, seems like the natural way things are. And it will always be that way, but that is, for the constructivist, that is not, that's an illusion. The idea that there are aspects of the social world that never change. Now there may be a few, but the constructivists try to limit that number that are fixed and changing to zero if possible. Okay, and these patterns occur because we believe this is how we should do things. We just keep repeating these habits. The idea is rooted in philosophy, but Peter Berger, Thomas Luckman published a book, Social Construction of Reality, which introduced these notions into sociology. It's been very influential. Constructivism has been applied to many fields, even to the physical sciences. The physical scientists, physicists, chemists aren't really they're not impressed, they're not persuaded that that scientific truth is constructed to the same extent that sociologists are. And there is a field called sociology of science where you will find social constructivists who are trying to understand the development of the scientific revolutions from the point of view of social products, social production. So, Luckman's Berger and Luckman's big conclusion was humans are social products and society is real. It's an objective reality, but it's our product. If it's our product, what does that mean? We can change it. We are creating it. We create it with every interaction. Every time we praise someone or are dismissive to someone or disrespect someone, that has an impact. That can have an impact on that person's next interaction. It can change their self image. It can reinforce a negative self image, depending upon or reinforce a positive one. But that's what how we create this world that we have to get by in. We're getting what we're giving. So just remember that. That's the end of lecture 1. I hope you've enjoyed it. Next up, so unsurprisingly, lecture 2, where I talk about sociological theories at length. However, we will revisit these theories and use these theories throughout the course. Uh, just by way of a preview, there are three broad groups of sociological theories: conflict theory, structural functionalism. I mentioned Talcott Parsons and his ideas. The way he was a good example of saying the way things are is the way they ought to be. So the best family structure is the one that was common in the United States and his world, the white middle class world in the 1930s. And the symbolic interactionists who deal with small group interactions, ground level, face to face stuff, not the big picture things that the conflict theorists and the structural functionalists tend to do, trying to explain the broad sweep of society and social change, or why there isn't much social change in the case of function. So, with that, I'll take an even longer break. Uh, Read chapter one. There's a quiz on chapter one from the book. That's the only quiz I believe you'll need to take using the material in the book. You're going to read some things that are different than I have, that are explained differently than I have. Try to see the commonality in those two approaches. Also, there's a PDF of this lecture that is already in Canvas. Some of you have already noticed it. PDF lectures is the name of the link on the grid. So, uh, said that, I'll see you in the next lecture or in virtual office hours. Don't forget about that. There will be probably shortly before, definitely before an exam and before any papers are due, group Q&A, which you will be invited to, where you can ask questions about specific assignments and so forth. And I will record that for those who cannot make the time to attend at the time it's scheduled. So it's another form of video that I will be um, connecting to the Canvas homepage. So